Hey friends, how are you? I'm Jared. I am a professional artist, former police officer, and welcome to part 3 of my PTSD symptoms series. In part 2, in part 2 I talked about what PTSD is. I shared a little bit about my journey of learning what PTSD is. And I wasn't able to discuss, my symptoms any further. So in this video, I will actually get into my symptoms. We'll resume that list that I had made. Again, going in order from how they appeared when I started my career to when I ended them. Getting back into the symptoms, again, these are in order as best as I can remember as they appeared. There is a general feeling of anger, frustration, and irritability toward absolutely everybody. Not necessarily just the people that we would have to deal with on the streets, but just being irritable at home, with friends and family, and with coworkers. And that that was a out of character thing because I hadn't experienced that before, and I certainly wasn't like that. I think at the time, I thought of it as just being cynical. And I knew every other police officer that I'd met in life, very cynical. And I thought that's just part of the natural progression. And besides, being cynical I thought was rather funny. But it really wasn't when you think about it and when I look back at that time. It's not a good road to go on. Really be mindful of how cynical you are. That's not something that you can or that you should be wearing as a badge of honor. It's something that you really should be paying attention to. I didn't pay attention to it. I just plowed forward and moved ahead with those symptoms. The next thing that I started to do was offload trauma through alcohol and partying. This is unfortunately such a typical way to offload trauma. People have a bad day at work. What do they often say? I'm going to go home, I'm going to have a drink, or I'm going to go to the bar, I'm going to have a drink. Very typical. It's what most of us learn as we grow up and go through life. And it's not a very healthy or sustainable way to offload trauma. There are typically consequences to that behavior or that way of offloading trauma. So bear in mind, there's a million ways to offload trauma, and I'll probably be touching on this in the future. I've probably mentioned this in the past, I can't remember for sure. But alcohol, very common. There's people with gambling issues. That could be a way to offload trauma. Take your pick. There's so many different ways. There's infidelity and other relationship issues that can be ways that people offload their trauma. So I would party, I would drink, and that would be my way to offload trauma. It wasn't frequent, and I wasn't, and I'm very thankful that I was never chemically dependent. However, I know that's also very typical I know often when it comes to first responders, there's a dual diagnosis. There's the PTSD and then there's the chemical dependency. It can be a really slippery slope. I know so many people, they started with, drinks here and there, offload their trauma this way or that way, and progressively gets worse until it becomes a major issue, and now problems are compounded because of the chemicals and because of the dependency. So something to be very mindful of, the way you offload trauma. So that's what I was doing, and that led to my next set of symptoms, which was risk-taking and out-of-character behavior. I won't touch a lot on that because it's pretty self-explanatory and it's personal. So you can imagine, if you're offloading your trauma with partying and drinking, and if you're also engaged in out-of-character behavior and risk-taking behavior, those things are not a very good mix. And I'm not just going to blame the alcohol and the partying. I was risk-taking and doing out-of-character behavior when I wasn't partying. And it was something that I look back on, and it's absolutely out of character, and I question what was going on. But at the time, it's just so bizarre, and it's not an excuse for the poor decisions that you make, for the things that happen. I can't blame, it was PTSD, therefore I'm exempt from consequences, or it's not that, it's not an excuse, it's just, I'm kind of explaining the symptoms and the process, if that makes sense. So next in my list of symptoms is hypervigilance. I could not settle down. I was constantly on edge, constantly looking for the threat. Because by this time, I had experienced enough in my career to know that there were a lot of legitimate threats out there, and there's a lot of potential for bad things to happen. And with first responders, and I think this is true for anybody, once your subconscious, once your nervous system knows that there is a potential, then that potential door can never be shut. So the things that I was aware of, the things that I were afraid of, that all came into play in all aspects of my life. If I was at home or further down the line, if I was at the yoga studio, I was still constantly on edge looking for the threat. Pretty bizarre, but again, that's where my nervous system was regulating itself. Moving along with my symptoms, another symptom that I noticed was my shaking hands, or what I describe as my shaking, trembling hands. It was noticeable a few years into my career, but then it got very noticeable as my career went forward, and even now, still fairly shaky, to the point of it altered how I do my artwork. I used to be really detailed in my drawing and in my painting. However, due to how much I shake and how badly I shake, I really had to alter my technique. I went to larger canvases when it comes to painting, and I do large sweeping motions with a paintbrush and with my hands because I simply can't do details. I don't even draw so much anymore because of it. So that's been a big frustration. I really remember there was one occasion that really stands out when I think about my shaking. And this was a little bit further into my career, but I was asked by a deputy to assist them at an arrest. So I went to the location, I got out of my squad, I saw the deputy standing with this individual, and he was gonna be arrested. I approached, and the deputy asked me if I could cuff him, asked me or motioned to me. At any rate, I took out my handcuffs, and I was so incredibly shaky. It was really visible. The deputy looked at me. I know he noticed it, but he didn't say anything. The subject that we were arresting, that I was handcuffing, definitely noticed it. He turned and he's like, "What, are you scared?" He said to me, and I just remember that being like such a shot to my ego. No, of course I wasn't scared. Maybe I was scared, but I couldn't admit that. But it was my nervous system. It's where I was, and yeah, I went through with cuffing the individual, brought him to jail. But yeah, it was so incredibly shaky, and I was so embarrassed for that too. And I never said anything to the deputy, and he never said anything to me, and nothing else was said on it. But that's something that was part of me through my career. So that was something that was really noticeable. And then the next thing that I noticed was nausea. I talked about digestive issues in prior videos, and just feeling nauseous. And it's just funny how these things happen, like at the beginning of my shift or before my shift. Obviously my body was telling me something, but I couldn't put one and one together. I didn't see the correlation between why I was feeling sick and at the beginning of my shifts or prior to my shifts. There were times that I was on patrol and I would stop, throw the door open, and throw up. And I would just shut the door and resume my patrol duties. Yeah, so my body was sending me a huge message there, but I just ignored it. And I continued to plow forward. All right, so to conclude, I'd like to leave you with an assignment, even though I'm not a teacher or a counselor. One thing that is really important is giving yourself a break, giving your nervous system a break. And something that I really got away from that was so important to me growing up is just having fun and playing. So if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is assign you playtime. I know it may sound silly, but it really isn't. Playtime is so critical to good mental health. If it's something that you're not used to, start really small, maybe just for a few minutes. It's important to give yourself that break, as I said. An example would be, if going for a walk is really fun for you, give yourself that time, allow yourself that time. But it's important to not tie your playtime with responsibility. So bringing your dog for a walk wouldn't count as playtime because that's a responsibility. So make sure that it's something just unique to you, something that would be fun, something that would give yourself a break from responsibility.